Boss replaced me with a cheaper supervisor after 22 years, 6 months of equipment failures later, and I realized something brutal. Loyalty only matters until it shows up on a spreadsheet as too expensive. One Friday afternoon, after 22 years of keeping an aging production line alive with sheer grit and duct tape miracles, my boss called me into his office, smiled like he was doing me a favor, and told me they were restructuring. That word landed like a shovel hitting dirt. I wasn't being moved up. I wasn't being protected. I was being buried, quietly, politely, and legally. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Grayson Lyle. For most of my adult life, I worked at a mid-sized manufacturing plant outside Dayton, Ohio. No glamour, no fancy titles, just long shifts, grease-stained hands, and a reputation for being the guy who could fix anything. I knew every rattle in the conveyor motors, every temperamental sensor, every valve that liked to stick when the humidity hit. I trained 3 plant managers over the years without ever being asked to. I stayed late when the night crew called in desperate. I missed birthdays and anniversaries, telling myself it was for stability, for pride, for the kind of career you could point at and say, I built something. My boss, Randall Voss, had been there only 4 years. He talked in corporate slogans and held meetings about efficiency culture. He'd clap my shoulder in the hallway and call me the backbone. Like that word was supposed to pay my mortgage. So when he told me they were eliminating my supervisor role and moving me into a lower-paid technical support position, I stared at him like he'd spoken a different language. He didn't say I'd done anything wrong. He said my experience was valuable, but the company needed leaner leadership costs. Then he introduced my replacement, a 28-year-old named Piers Halstead. Piers had a crisp polo shirt, a fresh clipboard, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been humbled by a machine that doesn't care about your degree. He was polite in that manufactured way, too many teeth, too much eye contact. Randall explained that Piers would be overseeing operations, and I would be supporting him with institutional knowledge. Institutional knowledge. That was me. 22 years distilled into a phrase that sounded like a file cabinet. I walked out of that office with a thin packet of paperwork and a thick knot of rage. Not loud rage, quiet rage. The kind that makes your ears burn while your face stays calm. I went back to the floor, and the line kept moving. The machines kept clanking like nothing had happened. The guys on my crew, Ronan Tate, Mavis Klein, Judd Marlowe, watched me carefully, like they could tell something had shifted. I didn't tell them yet. I couldn't, because saying it out loud would make it real. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my wife, Corinne, and told her what happened. She didn't cry. She went still, like a storm cloud gathering. Then she asked one question that echoed in my head for months. So after everything you gave them, they just traded you for cheaper hands? And that's when I realized this wasn't just a demotion. It was betrayal with a budget. The next Monday, Randall acted like nothing had happened. He walked the floor with Piers like they were on a tour, pointing at machinery as if it were museum exhibits. I was told to bring Piers up to speed. Not asked. Not thanked. Told. Randall framed it as teamwork, but it felt like humiliation with extra steps. I was supposed to teach the man replacing me how to do the job I'd already been doing better than anyone. Piers started calling me Gray, like we were buddies. He'd ask questions that proved he didn't understand the basics, and then he'd repeat my answers later in meetings like they were his own ideas. When I corrected him gently, he'd chuckle and say, I love the old school wisdom. Old school. Like I was a worn-out tool they kept in a drawer. The plant had quirks that couldn't be learned from manuals. The shrink-wrap station overheated if you pushed it past a certain rate. The press line needed a 15-minute cool-down after a jam, or it would shear pins. There was a sensor near Bay 3 that would throw ghost errors whenever the humidity climbed. If you didn't know that, you'd chase a problem that wasn't real and miss the one that was. These were the invisible stitches holding everything together, and for years, I'd been the one tying them. At first, I tried to do this with dignity. Corinne told me, keep your head high. Don't give them a reason. So I kept my tone professional. I wrote detailed notes. I showed Piers where the emergency parts were stored, which vendors shipped fastest, which machines needed weekly attention whether the schedule allowed it or not. The crew watched this unfold with tight expressions. Ronan, who had once called me the only boss he trusted, pulled me aside and said, "This doesn't feel right, Gray." I told him it wasn't about feelings. It was about paychecks. But the betrayal started bleeding into everything. Piers began making changes, little ones at first. He wanted to streamline maintenance checks, which meant skipping preventative inspections to keep output numbers pretty. He wanted less downtime, fewer stoppages, fewer unnecessary pauses. He started using phrases like acceptable risk. I'd spent 2 decades knowing that risk never stayed acceptable once metal started screaming. I warned him. I warned Randall too, once quietly, in the hallway near the break room. Randall smiled and said, "We're modernizing, Grayson. You've got to let the new leadership lead." It sounded like advice. It was a muzzle. Then came the first failure. A conveyor motor on line 2 started whining. Nothing dramatic, just a sound that meant the bearings were eating themselves. I told Piers we needed to swap it before it seized. He said, "Let's monitor it. We can't afford the downtime today." I wrote it down in my notebook anyway, because some habits never leave you. 2 days later, it seized. The belt stopped mid-run. Product backed up. Packaging piled up like a traffic jam. And the sound, when that motor died, was like a chokehold snapping shut. The crew scrambled. Piers went red-faced and started barking orders that didn't make sense. He called me over, frantic, and asked what to do. I fixed it because of course I did. Not for Randall. Not for Piers. For the crew, for the work, for the part of me that still couldn't watch a line die without stepping in. But something changed in me as I wiped grease off my hands. I realized I was still the one saving them. Only now I was doing it from a lower title, for lower pay, while my replacement took notes. And I started wondering how long the plant would survive leadership that treated experience like an expense. After that first breakdown, the failures didn't stop, they multiplied. Like the plant had been waiting for a crack in the dam. One machine went down, then another. A sensor fault turned into a jam turned into a bent guide rail, and a bent guide rail turned into hours of lost production. Every week there was something new, and every time it happened, Piers looked more startled, like the building itself was betraying him. The truth was simpler. The place had been held together by prevention, not heroics. Prevention is boring. It doesn't photograph well for quarterly reports. It doesn't look like leadership. It looks like routine. And Piers hated routine. He wanted wins. He wanted numbers. He wanted to impress Randall with dashboards and charts instead of doing the unglamorous work of keeping machines healthy. He cut lubrication cycles. He delayed part orders. He decided we could stretch service intervals because the equipment is rated for it. I told him ratings were marketing, not reality. He smiled and said, "You worry too much, Gray." One afternoon, in a supervisor's meeting I was no longer officially part of, but still expected to attend for support, Piers presented a plan to increase throughput by 9%. Randall beamed like a proud father. The plan included running line 4 at a higher speed without upgrading the cooling system, something we'd discussed years ago and rejected because it would overheat the seals. When I spoke up, Randall's eyes narrowed, not in anger, worse, like I was being inconvenient. Piers said, "We'll adapt if issues pop up." I said, "Issues don't pop up. They build." Quietly. Randall ended the discussion with a brisk, "Noted." That night, Corinne watched me rinse my hands in the kitchen sink, black water spiraling down the drain, and she said, "They're going to blame you when it all falls apart." Her voice wasn't dramatic, it was certain. Corinne had a gift for seeing the shape of things before they arrived. I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe the company had enough integrity to own its own decisions. Then the email came, an updated responsibility chart. It didn't give me authority. It gave me accountability. It listed me as maintenance liaison, the person responsible for communicating preventative needs. In other words, I didn't get to make decisions anymore, but if something wasn't communicated, it would be my fault. They'd built a trap out of paperwork. So I started documenting everything. Not out of revenge at first, out of survival. I logged warnings. I wrote dates, times, machine IDs, what I recommended, and what was decided instead. I kept copies of work orders that were postponed. I saved maintenance schedules that were cut down. I didn't announce it. I just did it quietly because I could feel the air changing. The crew felt it too. Ronan told me the line operators were nervous. Mavis said she'd heard whispers that corporate was coming for an inspection. Judd, who rarely complained, said, "We're running these machines like we're trying to kill them." And every time something failed, I watched Piers scramble, watched Randall grow more tense, and watched the plant's rhythm turn from steady to panicked. 6 months in, the the failures reached the kind that didn't just cost money, they risked people. A pressure valve on line 1 stuck during a high-volume run, and the release hissed so loud the whole bay froze. For a heartbeat, everyone thought it was going to blow. It didn't, but the fear in the room lingered like smoke. Peers called it a freak incident. I called it the invoice coming due. And deep down, I knew the next step in this story wasn't going to be another breakdown. It was going to be a hunt for someone to sacrifice. The day corporate showed up, the plant felt like a courtroom before the verdict. 2 people in clean shoes walked the floor with clipboards, their badges swinging against pressed shirts. Randall hovered close to them, talking fast. Piers stayed glued to Randall's side, nodding like a dashboard ornament. Everyone else tried to look busy in that unnatural way people do when they're scared. The inspection didn't start with the big dramatic failures. It started with little questions. Why was the spare parts inventory low? Why were preventative work orders incomplete? Why did the downtime logs show a spike over the past quarter? Those questions had answers, but the kind of answers Randall didn't want to say out loud. I stood back until one of the corporate reps, an operations auditor named Lenora Dax, asked directly, "Who oversees maintenance strategy?" Randall didn't hesitate. He gestured toward me like he was pointing at a stain on a carpet. "Grayson handles maintenance communication and support." Support. Communication. Words designed to sound harmless. But the effect was immediate. Lenora's eyes shifted to me, and the room tilted. My stomach dropped as I realized Randall wasn't just deflecting. He was aiming. Piers jumped in smoothly. "Grayson's been here a long time. He knows the equipment better than anyone. He advises me." Advises. Another careful word. It suggested I had influence. It suggested if problems happened, the person with the knowledge had failed to use it properly. It was subtle, almost elegant, betrayal dressed in business language. I felt heat rise up my neck. For months I'd been swallowing my pride, doing the job anyway, fixing their messes, trying to keep the crew safe while my pay and title were stripped down. And now, standing under fluorescent lights with corporate watching, Randall and Piers were quietly placing the failures at my feet. So I stopped being nice. I said calmly, "I can show you my recommendations if you'd like." My voice didn't shake, but my hands wanted to. "I've documented every preventative item I flagged since the restructure, including approvals and deferrals." Randall's face tightened. Not panic, anger. The kind of anger people get when they realize the person they underestimated has receipts. Lenora turned fully toward me. "You documented deferrals?" "Yes," I said. "Dates, equipment IDs, and who signed off." Piers blinked like he'd been slapped. Randall cut in quickly. "Grayson, now's not the time for." "It's exactly the time," I said, still calm. "Because I'm not wearing decisions I didn't make." There was a silence that felt like a blade laid flat on a table. The crew nearby pretended not to listen, but every ear was turned toward us. Ronan's eyes met mine across the aisle, and he gave the smallest nod, like he'd been waiting for me to finally stand up. Lenora asked me to email the documentation. Randall tried to override, suggested they could summarize internally, but Lenora's tone sharpened. "Send it directly to me." That was the moment I understood corporate wasn't there to protect Randall. They were there to protect the company. And Randall, who had used me as a shield, was suddenly realizing shields can move. That evening, Randall called me into his office again. Same chair. Same fake calm. But his voice had an edge. He said my attitude was becoming a problem. He implied I was undermining leadership. He hinted that if I didn't get aligned, there could be consequences. I listened, nodded once, and left without arguing. Not because I was scared, but because I knew arguing was useless. I didn't need to convince Randall of anything. I only needed to keep doing what I'd started, documenting, protecting myself, and waiting. Because a plant doesn't spiral like that without someone falling. And I had a growing suspicion it wasn't going to be me. If you want, I'll continue with Part 2, Sections 5 to 8, where the equipment failures peak, Randall and Piers turn on each other, and Grayson's quiet documentation becomes the lever that flips the entire power structure. 2 weeks after the corporate visit, the plant felt like it was holding its breath. Randall Voss started prowling the floor more, suddenly hands-on. Suddenly acting like he cared about the hum and grind of the machines he'd been ignoring. Piers Halstead, on the other hand, got sharper, more defensive, more controlling. He stopped asking me questions in front of people. When he needed help, he'd pull me aside like he was doing me a secret favor, then later act like the fix was his call. The crew noticed. Ronan Tate started keeping his distance from Piers entirely. Mavis Klein kept her face blank in meetings, but came to me afterward with quiet updates, like we were all bracing for the next collapse. It came on a Tuesday during the second shift, right when production was running hot to make up for the downtime numbers corporate had flagged. Line 4, the one with the cooling system I'd warned about, began overheating exactly the way I said it would. You could smell it before you saw it, that harsh, chemical hot odor of seals cooking. I told Piers we needed to throttle down and let it cool. He snapped back that we were behind schedule and he'd already approved a workaround. His workaround was pushing the machine harder and praying it didn't bite. It bit. A seal failed and dumped fluid where it shouldn't have gone. A pallet stacker jerked, misaligned, and slammed into a guardrail. The noise was violent, metal hitting metal with the kind of force that makes your chest tighten. One of the operators, a quiet guy named Soren Delaney, stumbled backward trying to avoid the swing of the equipment and went down hard. His elbow hit the concrete with a crack I'll never forget. The whole bay froze for half a second, then exploded into shouting. People calling for first aid, someone yelling to shut the line down, alarms chirping like frantic birds. I ran to Soren first. Not because I was a hero, because after 22 years, my body moved before my anger did. He was pale and sweating, biting down on pain, trying to act like it wasn't that bad. But his arm was already swelling in a way that made my stomach twist. Ronan helped me get him seated. Mavis brought the first aid kit. Judd Marlowe cleared the area. Piers hovered like a man watching his career slip on spilled oil. When the medical team finally arrived and took Soren away, Piers turned toward me with a flushed face and said, loud enough for people to hear, "Why wasn't that seal replaced during preventative?" It was such a clean, vicious move that for a moment I almost admired it. He was trying to make the injury my fault. Randall wasn't even there yet, but Piers didn't need him. He'd learned the same language of deflection. The crew went quiet, the way people do when they're waiting to see who gets sacrificed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't posture. I just said, it was on the list. Deferred. Then I looked him in the eye and added, I wrote it down. You initialed it. His mouth opened, then closed. Like his brain couldn't decide whether to deny it or pretend it didn't matter. Randall arrived minutes later, breathless and furious. Not at the failure, not at the injury, but at the scene. He pulled Piers aside and I heard fragments. Corporate liability, numbers. Then Randall's eyes slid toward me, and I recognized the look immediately. It wasn't leadership. It was panic looking for a target. That night, I didn't sleep. Corinne sat beside me on the couch while I rechecked my notebook, the work orders, the emails. She didn't interrupt. When I finally looked up, she said, "They'll try to make you the villain because you're the one they already pushed down. They think you'll stay down." I stared at the pages in my lap and realized something cold and steady. I wasn't going to stay down. Not quietly. Not again. 3 days later, Randall scheduled a performance alignment meeting. The subject line was so bland it felt insulting. He asked me to come in at 8 a.m. before the floor got busy. He said Piers would be there too, to make sure everyone's on the same page. That was all I needed to know. It wasn't a meeting. It was a setup. Corinne told me not to go in unprepared. So I didn't. I printed what I had. Work orders. Maintenance schedules. Notes from meetings where I'd raised concerns. Emails where I'd warned about line 4 overheating. I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't threaten anyone. I just brought the truth in a neat stack of paper. When I walked into Randall's office, Piers was already seated, legs crossed like he belonged there. Randall started with the kind of slow, disappointed tone managers use when they're about to rewrite history. He said there were concerns about my communication. He said the recent failures suggested a lack of proactive leadership. He said the injury incident showed process gaps. Then he slid a document across the desk, a written warning. It accused me of failing to escalate urgent maintenance needs. It claimed I had resisted new operational directives. It was written like I was a stubborn old man sabotaging progress. I read it without reacting. And in that moment, I understood their plan. Randall had replaced me with someone cheaper, watched the place start breaking, and now needed to prove the breaking wasn't his fault. Piers needed to prove he wasn't incompetent. The easiest story was that the old supervisor, me, had been the problem all along. So I told Randall, I'm going to respond to this in writing. He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand calmly, not aggressively, and said, before you finalize anything, I want to show you something. I laid my documentation on his desk. I didn't toss it down dramatically. I placed it carefully like evidence. I pointed to dates. I pointed to the exact line items. I showed the seal replacement on line 4 marked defer, with Piers's initials. I showed my email warning that increasing speed without cooling upgrades would lead to seal failure. I showed a maintenance schedule that had been cut in half after the restructure. Randall's face changed in small increments. First irritation, then disbelief, then something closer to fear. Piers leaned forward, scanning the pages, and I saw his throat bob when he swallowed. Randall tried to pivot, said the documentation was helpful, but insisted the tone of my approach was not collaborative. That's when I said the sentence I'd been holding back for months. You can demote me, Randall, but you can't make me responsible for decisions you took away from me. Silence. The kind that has weight. Randall told me to leave the documents with him. I refused. I said I'd provide copies to corporate operations, Lenora Dax, exactly as requested. Randall's jaw tightened so hard I thought a tooth might crack. He warned me softly that I was going outside the chain of command. I told him, "You already took my chain. All I have left is accuracy." I walked out feeling shaky, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Ronan caught me by the time clock and asked, "How bad was it?" I didn't tell him details. I just said they tried. And he nodded like he'd expected nothing else. That afternoon, I emailed Lenora the full packet. Not a rant. Not a plea. Just dates, facts, and proof. And once that email left my outbox, I knew there was no going back. Corporate came back fast. Not with a friendly follow-up. With an unannounced audit team. The kind that shows up when money is bleeding and someone's trying to hide the knife. They asked for downtime logs, purchasing records, maintenance deferral approvals, injury reports, training records. They interviewed operators privately. They walked the floor with grim faces and asked questions Randall couldn't answer without contradicting his own paperwork. For the first time in months, I watched Piers sweat in silence. Randall tried to perform. He talked about new initiatives, temporary turbulence, rapid scaling. But the audit team didn't care about his vocabulary. They cared about signatures. They cared about timestamps. They cared about why essential parts weren't ordered until after equipment failed. They cared about why preventative maintenance had been optimized into meaninglessness. They cared about why an experienced supervisor was demoted while a less experienced one was elevated during a period of rising failures. The crew's testimonies were the part Randall didn't control. Ronan spoke plainly that preventative checks were skipped because Piers wanted numbers. Mavis described being told to make it work with worn parts. Judd explained how warnings were brushed off until breakdowns forced action. None of them sounded vindictive. They sounded tired. That's what made them believable. Then the auditors called me in. Lenora was there. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She just asked me to walk them through my documentation and explain my role after the restructure. I told the truth. I'd been stripped of authority, kept as a fixer, and blamed when fixes were needed. I explained how maintenance works when it's done properly. How the best day in a plant is the day nothing exciting happens because the boring work was done on time. I didn't insult Piers. I didn't call Randall names. I let the records speak, and I filled in only what the records couldn't show. The pressure, the shortcuts, the choices. 2 days after that interview, Randall called an all-hands meeting. His voice was tight. He announced organizational changes effective immediately. Piers was being released from the company. Randall said it like Piers had simply drifted away on a pleasant breeze, not like he'd been shoved off a sinking ship. But the real shock came next. Randall himself was being placed on administrative leave pending further review. The room didn't cheer. This wasn't a movie. People just absorbed it quietly, like they'd been carrying a heavy box, and someone finally told them they could set it down. Ronan exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Mavis's eyes looked wet, but she blinked it away. Judd shook his head once, slow, like he couldn't believe accountability was happening in real life. After the meeting, Lenora approached me privately near the maintenance cage. She said, "We need stability. We need someone who understands the floor and can rebuild trust." Then she offered me my supervisor position back, restored title, restored pay, plus a retention bonus. Not out of kindness. Out of necessity. The plant had learned the hard way that cheaper leadership costs more when equipment starts dying. I should have felt triumphant. Part of me did. But mostly, I felt something else, grief. Because none of it brought back the months of humiliation. None of it erased Soren Delaney's injury. None of it made Randall's betrayal hurt less. It just proved I wasn't imagining it. I accepted the role. Not because I forgave them, because the crew needed someone to stop the bleeding, and I wasn't going to let the place collapse just to prove a point. But my revenge wasn't loud. It was simple. I survived them. And I let the truth end them. Rebuilding the plant after those 6 months felt like rebuilding after a fire. Everything looked the same, but the trust was charred. I started with the basics. Preventative schedules returned to what they used to be, not what looked good on a spreadsheet. Parts inventory was rebuilt. I met with every shift lead, every operator who wanted to talk. I didn't deliver speeches. I asked what they'd been afraid to say while Piers was in charge. The answers were painful because they were practical. People didn't feel safe slowing the line down. People felt punished for stopping a problem early. People felt like machines mattered more than humans. Soren Delaney eventually came back with his arm healed enough to work. The first day he returned, he looked at Line 4 like it was a wild animal. I pulled him aside and told him 2 things. First, I was sorry, not because it was my decision, but because I was there when it happened and it never should have. Second, if he ever felt unsafe again, he had my direct permission to stop the line and call me. No punishment. No arguments. Just stop. His shoulders loosened a little when he heard that, like someone had finally handed him a piece of control back. As for Randall, his administrative leave became a termination a month later. No parade, no apology to me, no public confession. He was just gone, like an erased line on a budget. Piers disappeared too. I heard through the grapevine he tried to frame the whole thing as legacy resistance in interviews. Maybe some company believed him. But the people who watched him cut corners didn't. Corporate asked me if I wanted to file a formal complaint. They said I had a strong case, implied they'd settle quietly. Corinne looked at me across our kitchen table when I told her and said, "What do you want, Gray?" Not what they deserve, what you want. That question mattered. I wanted my peace back. I wanted my name clean. I wanted the crew protected. I wanted to walk into work without feeling like I'd swallowed nails. So I negotiated, not revenge in the form of screaming or lawsuits, but revenge in the form of leverage. I secured written authority tied to my role, so no one could make me accountable without giving me control. I got training budgets restored. I got a formal safety pause policy signed and posted, so operators could stop a line without fear. And I got an agreement that any major changes to maintenance scheduling required my sign-off and corporate safety review. Then I went home one Friday, sat on my porch with Corinne, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Quiet. Corinne asked, "Do you feel like you won?" I thought about Randall's smile when he demoted me. I thought about Piers calling me old school. I thought about the sound of that machine slamming the guardrail. I thought about the crew's faces during the audit, tired, hopeful, scared. "I don't feel like I won," I said. "I feel like I stopped losing." And maybe that's the real version of revenge people don't talk about. Not the dramatic moment where you crush someone, but the steady, stubborn choice to keep records, tell the truth, protect your people, and outlast the ones who thought you were disposable. Randall tried to replace 22 years with a cheaper nameplate. 6 months of equipment failures later, the company learned the price of betrayal. And I learned something too. The quietest person in the room is often the one holding the receipts.